Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford, and this is my supervisor, Nugget the Parakeet. And this week, we're going to talk, I'm going to talk to you about the Danish method of cross stitch. Now, before I get too much further, I want to remind you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave me a comment. It doesn't cost you anything to do those things, but it really helps me out. So if you've learned anything from me on any of my videos, I appreciate it if you take just a moment to do those three things. Now, the Danish method is something that you'll frequently hear talked about in the context of cross stitch, but even among people who don't know the term, it's a technique that's widely used. I know that I used it for years before I ever learned that that was what it's called. And simply put, the Danish method is a technique where you do the first half of a group of stitches, whether that's a row of stitches or a little cluster or a group in half stitches, and then you complete those stitches on the way back through. So as an example, I've done the first half of this little row of green stitches here, and then I would just complete those stitches on the way back. Or I could go down and do the next row, and the next row do like a group or a cluster of them, which is how I tend to work. Now, there are a number of advantages to using this technique, which is why it's such a common way to do stitching. A lot of people don't know that this has a name, and to them it's just how cross stitching is done. And I was the same way for a really long time as well. So what other ways of stitching are there? The most common would be what's called the English method. And with the English method, instead of doing half of each stitch and then crossing those stitches, you just do each little X one at a time, like this. You might be asking, why is it called Danish method? And the answer to that is, I couldn't find any reliable resources that could actually cite a specific reason. People just speculate maybe it came from or became popular in Denmark. But as far as I can tell, nobody really actually knows. So what are the advantages of using Danish method? Why is it so popular? Well, there are a handful of reasons. One is that it gives you a consistent direction of pull and tension on your stitches that helps them look a little bit more uniform and neat. It also is a tiny bit more efficient with floss usage. Such a small difference that it's really negligible, but it is there a little bit, and it does help keep the back of your project looking a little bit tidy. If you look here, you can see the difference between my Danish method stitches, which are just a series of little vertical lines here, and my English method stitches, which are vertical lines combined with diagonal lines. One personal reason that I like to use it a lot is that I can do the first half of a bunch of stitches in an area, and then when I'm doing the other half of those stitches, I don't have to do any counting, I don't have to look at my pattern, I can just stitch away and cross all of those stitches. So frequently, if I'm going to be riding a bus or a plane the day before, I'll do all of my stitches as half stitches. I'll do the first half of a bunch of stitches, and then I'll just cross them all later, because I won't need to find a place to put my pattern, I'll be able to just do all the crossing. I want to take just a second right now to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Stitch Club email. You'll get advance notice of any upcoming projects, stitch-alongs, retreats that Caterpillar might be coming out with. Plus, you'll get an ebook with 9 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in it, including a year-long tracker pattern. You can use it as a temperature tracker, mood tracker, chore chart, whatever you like. Make sure you hit the link down there in the description to get all of that great stuff. So what are some circumstances in which you might not want to use the Danish method? I try to avoid words like should or ought to when I'm talking about stitching, because the only thing you really ought to do when it comes to stitching is enjoy it. If the techniques that I talk about don't bring you joy, toss them out. Marie Kondo that crap. But there are circumstances where personally I don't really like to use the Danish method. One really notable one would be when using variegated thread. If you check out my video on using variegated thread, you'll be able to see why that is and what a difference that makes. But it makes sure that the gradual color change in the thread stays in one place instead of kind of canceling itself out when you go back the other direction. Nugget has asked me to remind you about the importance of having a flock. I think they mean a social group. The group that surrounds the Caterpillar Cross Stitch brand is a really amazing, creative, supportive community, and I highly recommend checking it out. You can find that in the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group and in the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Instagram. So check both of those out so you can get all of the great advantages of being a member of a community like that. Another time I will do the whole stitch at once is when I'm doing confetti stitches or little individual stitches of a particular color, either out in an unstitched area or nestled in among a bunch of other stitches. I don't want to go over there and then come back on the back of my fabric. It's inefficient use of floss, and running multiple times will increase the likelihood that the run on the back will be visible from the front, so I don't want to do that. Another time that I will refrain from using the Danish method is when I am stitching 1/1 on linen. Now you can still use something similar to the Danish method, but you will want to use tent stitch rather than half stitch. Go check out my video about the difference between those two there, because if you use half stitches 1/1 on linen, your stitches can pull through the weave of the fabric. So make sure that you're doing a tent stitch if you're using this technique on linen. Another time I will refrain from using the Danish method is when I'm stitching a vertical column of stitches on my fabric. In order to stitch that vertical column, I have to pull my stitches tight in a different direction each time, and that will create uneven tension directionality on my stitches, and they'll look sloppy. So I'll sort of usually do like a horizontal stitch on the back instead of the vertical one, so it's similar to the Danish method. But not quite the same. So what about you? Do you use the Danish method? Did you know it was called that? Do you happen to be a fiber arts historian who can tell me why it's called the Danish method? Leave it in the comments down below. I'd really appreciate that. I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, I'm Ford, and this is Nugget, and we'll see you next time.